In 2009, a classified after-action report landed on a Pentagon desk, containing a single statistical comparison that made senior military officials physically uncomfortable. Over the preceding 12 months, a unit of roughly 150 Australian operators had neutralized more high-value Taliban commanders in southern Afghanistan than 3 entire American battalions combined. Someone had scrawled a handwritten note in the margin of that specific intelligence report, featuring just 2 simple but commanding words: copy them. The story of how that note came to exist is one of the most remarkable chapters in modern military history. Let us rewind to the beginning, to the precise moment the Americans first laid eyes on the men they would eventually be forced to imitate. Afghanistan, by the mid-2000s, had become the Pentagon's most ambitious experiment in turning a volatile war zone into a heavily fortified corporate campus. Bagram Airfield, the absolute crown jewel of American military infrastructure, stretched across nearly 15 square kilometers of dusty Afghan plateau. It housed a constantly rotating military and civilian population that regularly exceeded 40,000 souls, operating under a vast and increasingly complex administrative bureaucracy. The sprawling base featured incredible amenities, including a Burger King, a Pizza Hut, and a Tim Hortons specifically for the Canadian contingent. There was a long boardwalk lined with various souvenir shops, intensely air-conditioned gymnasiums with massive flat-screen televisions permanently tuned to American sports channels, a dedicated fire department, an internal bus route, and a massive detention facility that operated under its own unique legal framework. Kandahar Airfield matched it almost amenity for amenity, creating a surreal bubble of Western comfort, isolated entirely from the harsh realities of the surrounding Afghan environment. Between these 2 colossal military installations, the civilian contractor workforce actively outnumbered the actual combat soldiers by a margin that defense auditors found genuinely alarming. The immense book of regulations governing daily life on these fortified bases read exactly like the employee handbook of an especially paranoid insurance company. A tired soldier walking to the latrine at 3 in the morning was strictly required to wear a heavy Kevlar helmet, a full ceramic plate body armor vest, and the legendary reflective PT belt, creating a bizarrely regimented environment disconnected from tactical reality. This fluorescent neon strip was originally designed for morning jogs, yet certain base commanders had bizarrely elevated it to the absolute status of a sacred talisman. Troops caught wandering without the glowing belt faced immediate and severe disciplinary write-ups from patrolling military police. The Taliban, meanwhile, faced absolutely no such paperwork when American units finally ventured beyond the protective wire. Whenever conventional forces decided to leave the base, the suffocating bureaucracy rode shotgun with them, dictating every single operational parameter and significantly hindering their ability to effectively combat a highly mobile enemy insurgency. A standard American patrol required a massive convoy of mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, each weighing roughly 18 tons and costing approximately $1 million. Dedicated helicopter support was considered absolutely mandatory before any unit could cross the threshold. Pre-mission intelligence briefings consumed countless hours of preparation. Base legal advisors meticulously vetted every single potential target, ensuring strict compliance with complex rules of engagement. Extensive risk assessments had to be painstakingly signed, heavily countersigned, and officially filed in triplicate before any commander would authorize the heavily armored convoy to proceed into hostile territory. By the time mission clearance finally filtered down through the convoluted chain of command, the tactical intelligence was often so terribly stale that the target had relocated to a different valley entirely. The deeply entrenched Taliban fighters had intelligently learned to exploit every single one of these predictable bureaucratic rituals with the infinite patience of men who had been fighting foreign armies for centuries. They carefully monitored the massive bases, studying the sluggish American deployment patterns, and utilizing the enemy's own administrative delays to effectively orchestrate their highly successful hit-and-run guerrilla campaigns across the region. While American forces built an absurdly regulated corporate campus in a war zone, a handful of unkempt Australians arrived carrying a methodology that would eventually humiliate the global military establishment. Into the absolute middle of this incredibly expensive, highly regimented military circus walked a small group of rugged men who looked exactly like they had been violently dragged behind a moving truck through the treacherous Khyber Pass. This was the highly secretive Australian Special Air Service Regiment contingent, quietly rotating through the vast Afghan theater to conduct highly classified operations far beyond the perimeter wire. These elite operators primarily deployed from Campbell Barracks, situated in Swanbourne, a very quiet, unassuming coastal suburb of Perth that most ordinary Australians would genuinely struggle to locate on a standard map. Their entire annual operational military budget amounted to nothing more than a simple rounding error in the massive, trillion-dollar Pentagon spreadsheets. They arrived at the sprawling Bagram and Kandahar airfields, completely disregarding the established protocols, bringing with them an entirely foreign mindset that fundamentally rejected the heavily corporatized approach to modern counterinsurgency warfare favored by their well-funded American coalition partners. The Australian operators confidently strode through the massive bases, sporting wild beards that reached down past their collars and unruly hair that had clearly not seen regulation scissors in several months. Their utterly baffling dress code appeared to have been chaotically designed by a local charity shop currently hosting a massive clearance sale. They wore deeply faded t-shirts, ripped-sleeve camouflage tops, traditional Afghan pokhole hats, and locally purchased chamois scarves tightly wrapped around their weathered necks and faces, looking remarkably indistinguishable from the local indigenous population they were specifically deployed to protect and interact with. They wore absolutely no official name tapes, bore no visible rank insignia, and carried absolutely no identifying unit patches of any recognizable kind on their dusty, mismatched uniforms. An extremely confused American staff officer who happened to encounter these rugged men for the very first time reportedly stopped them in the dust and directly asked whether they were highly paid private security contractors, embedded freelance journalists, or simply a group of terribly lost civilian backpackers. The Australians merely smiled, offering a completely polite but remarkably vague response that left the officer even more bewildered. The immediate institutional reaction from the strict American base commanders was predictably swift and remarkably furious. Formal, highly documented complaints were rapidly filed concerning these egregious grooming standard violations. Official memoranda aggressively circulated throughout the headquarters, demanding that the rogue Australians immediately conform to the established coalition dress regulations. One particularly indignant United States Army colonel even attempted to physically bar the SASR personnel from entering the main dining facility, strictly on the absurd grounds of improper battlefield hygiene, completely failing to understand the lethal efficiency hiding beneath their scruffy, thoroughly unconventional exterior. The Australians absorbed all of this intense bureaucratic outrage with the serene indifference of men who had far more important things to worry about than the fragile feelings of indignant desk officers. Because entirely hidden behind that scruffy exterior was a lethal methodology that had been brutally refined across 6 decades of unforgiving warfare. They brought hard lessons learned from the dense jungle warfare in Borneo, extensive desert operations in the harsh Middle East, and the absolute peacekeeping nightmares they survived in East Timor. The elite SASR operators had deeply learned through massive amounts of blood and endless repetition a fundamental principle that the entire American military establishment had spent literally trillions of dollars trying to engineer around. In a complex counterinsurgency environment, the side that effectively blends into the local population survives the longest. Conversely, the heavily armed side that proudly stands out immediately becomes an incredibly lucrative target. This raw philosophy directly dictated every single operational decision they made in the perilous Afghan theater. The wild beards that infuriated the American chain of command served a highly precise and critical operational function in this deeply traditional society. Within the strict parameters of local Pashtun culture, a clean-shaven man was universally considered either a young child or someone completely unworthy of serious adult conversation. American soldiers, universally sporting their regulation military crew cuts and perpetually baby-smooth faces, instantly triggered immediate cultural distrust in absolutely every single remote mountain village they aggressively entered during their heavily armed patrols. The weathered Australians, looking remarkably like particularly rugged members of the actual local indigenous population, could calmly sit down with powerful tribal elders and respectfully share traditional meals. Through these quiet interactions, they managed to extract invaluable human intelligence that heavily armed American patrols could absolutely never access. The Americans always found the metaphorical door forcefully slammed tightly shut in their faces, well before they could even finish shouting their very first translated opening sentence through a terrified local civilian interpreter. This aggressive, stripped-down gear philosophy went even deeper into their tactical doctrine. Consider the fact that a fully loaded conventional American military operator routinely carried upwards of 60 kilograms of sophisticated combat equipment. This massive burden included heavy ceramic ballistic plates, complex electronic countermeasures, bulky hydration bladders, advanced satellite GPS units, complicated night vision arrays, and more than enough heavy ammunition to physically sustain a massive, prolonged, and incredibly deafening firefight against a fully entrenched platoon of hardened insurgent enemy combatants. In stark contrast, a standard Australian SASR patrol member carried roughly 35 kilograms of essential gear and genuinely considered even that relatively light burden to be entirely excessive for their needs. Within their incredibly strict operational mindset, absolutely every single gram saved was a crucial meter further they could walk into the mountains. It meant an hour longer they could comfortably patrol through the punishing terrain, and a decibel quieter they could seamlessly move through the pitch-black darkness of the freezing Afghan nights. And then there were the deeply controversial patrol vehicles that physically made conventional American commanding officers violently wince in pure, unadulterated institutional horror. The Australians relied entirely on special reconnaissance vehicles, which were highly modified, extremely long-range patrol platforms based initially on standard civilian Land Rover designs and later on advanced Supercat chassis frameworks. These incredibly bizarre machines had been systematically stripped of all conventional doors, protective roofs, heavy windshields, and absolutely anything else that added unnecessary weight or restricted the crew's vital vision. They were completely unarmored, leaving the operators entirely open to freezing rain, blinding dust, howling wind, and highly lethal incoming enemy machine gun fire. They looked exactly like something a rugged cattle station manager working in the vast Australian Northern Territory might actively use to aggressively round up stray animals during a severe drought. Any high-ranking American military commanders who personally saw them parked directly alongside their own hulking, heavily armored MRAPs experienced something dangerously close to profound physical and mental distress. A particularly concerned United States Army colonel once approached an Australian troop commander to directly ask how his men ever expected to survive a catastrophic IED blast while riding in those flimsy contraptions. The veteran Australian operator reportedly offered a polite smile and calmly explained that their primary tactical plan was to simply avoid hitting the deadly IEDs entirely. This completely foreign concept utterly baffled the American officer, whose entire military doctrine relied heavily on surviving the inevitable explosions, rather than proactively avoiding them. Unlike a massive 20-ton armored truck loudly announcing its heavy mechanical presence to absolutely every single hidden insurgent triggerman hiding within a 5-mile earshot, an unarmored SRV could travel completely unnoticed. The Americans spent billions engineering 20-ton armored beasts to absorb bomb blasts. The Australians simply decided to never encounter the bombs in the first place. These stripped-down vehicles could move quietly, incredibly quickly, and along entirely unexpected mountain routes that no conventional military vehicle commander would ever seriously attempt to successfully navigate. The rigid American military establishment had predictably responded to the massive, highly lethal IED epidemic across the country by blindly building progressively larger vehicles that could physically absorb the tremendous explosive blasts. The agile Australians had brilliantly responded to that exact same deadly threat by purposefully building significantly lighter vehicles that would simply never encounter the catastrophic blast in the very first place. One incredibly stubborn institutional approach cost American taxpayers billions of dollars, while the other approach primarily cost sheer tactical ingenuity. This stark divergence in fundamental operational philosophy set the perfect stage for the undeniable combat results that would soon follow. What the Pentagon initially viewed as a suicidal lack of armor was, in reality, a masterclass in invisibility that left the enemy entirely unprepared for the violence heading their way. The elite Australians were quietly preparing to entirely rewrite the tactical rulebook of modern counterinsurgency warfare, effectively proving that stealth and cultural integration were vastly superior to overwhelming, deafening, and heavily armored brute force. Here is where the story shifts from a mere culture clash into something that senior Pentagon strategists still genuinely struggle to adequately explain without looking profoundly uncomfortable in operational briefings. While coalition forces operated on a predictable commuter schedule, SASR patrols simply vanished into the brutal Afghan landscape for 40 days at a time, becoming indistinguishable from the dust. American forces operated on a strictly regimented daily timeline, leaving the heavily fortified wire in the morning and securely returning to hot meals and aggressive air conditioning by evening. The SASR patrols completely defied this conventional logic, disappearing into the vast Afghan wilderness for extended periods that entirely staggered their conventional coalition partners back at the massive headquarters. Spending 30 continuous days out in the hostile field was considered entirely routine for these elite operators. Enduring 40 days happened regularly, pushing the absolute limits of human physical endurance and deeply testing their incredible psychological resilience in one of the most unforgiving, mountainous combat environments currently existing anywhere on the modern planet. During these incredibly extended autonomous deployments, the rugged Australians survived in brutal conditions that would have absolutely generated a massive congressional investigation if ever forced upon regular American personnel. They deliberately slept in shallow, scraped-out hollows positioned directly on freezing mountain passes, reaching well above 3,000 meters in altitude. They went completely without basic washing facilities for multiple consecutive weeks, until their weathered skin naturally took on the exact same dusty, gray-brown, earthy tone as the jagged rocks surrounding their hidden fighting positions. They deliberately ate local food exclusively, purchasing basic flatbread, rice, and freshly slaughtered goat meat directly from wandering mountain shepherds they encountered during their long, silent foot patrols. They did this because they had fully absorbed a remarkably hard tactical lesson initially learned through bitter blood in the sweltering jungles of the Vietnam War. The myriad chemical preservatives heavily packed into standard Western military ration packs, the infamous MREs that American soldiers considered barely edible, even under the best circumstances, produced a highly distinctive body odor. The veteran Viet Cong fighters had easily smelled that artificial chemical scent radiating through the thick jungle canopy decades ago, and the hardened Taliban insurgents smelled it clearly in Afghanistan too. A heavily armed combat patrol that strongly reeked of heavily processed cheese and terribly artificial beef flavoring might as well have been openly carrying a massive, brightly illuminated neon sign through the darkness. The resourceful Australians permanently eliminated this massive tactical problem entirely at the absolute source by adopting an indigenous diet that perfectly masked their scent. They confidently drove their highly exposed, open-topped special reconnaissance vehicles deep into plunging, treacherous valleys so incredibly remote that conventional American military planners had explicitly marked them as totally inaccessible. These were dangerous gray zones boldly highlighted on massive operational maps where no heavy armored MRAP could ever physically travel, and therefore, in the deeply flawed logic of the Pentagon, absolutely no enemy threat could possibly exist. The highly experienced Australians fundamentally knew significantly better than to implicitly trust these deeply optimistic bureaucratic intelligence assessments. Upon reaching their destination, they skillfully hid their dusty vehicles under heavy camouflage, netting deep inside dry, rocky riverbeds, securely wedging them tightly into narrow rock crevices, completely out of sight. They meticulously covered them with local scrub brush, and then methodically climbed to commanding vantage points, where they established highly concealed observation posts. These crucial hidden positions remained entirely active and completely undetected for many consecutive days, sometimes comfortably exceeding a full week of continuous, uninterrupted surveillance over a highly valuable, heavily guarded insurgent target compound. What actually happened during those incredibly long, perfectly silent watches violently exposed the absolute most expensive surveillance apparatus in human military history, as an elaborate and extraordinarily costly strategic bluff. The United States was currently spending countless billions of dollars annually on advanced Predator and Reaper drone programs to actively monitor the chaotic battlefield. They were constantly flying sophisticated unmanned aircraft at 20,000 feet, obsessively watching the ground through highly advanced thermal imaging cameras that merely rendered moving human beings as entirely fuzzy, indistinct white shapes. From that extreme operational altitude, a high-value Taliban regional commander and a completely innocent local goat farmer were virtually indistinguishable to the highly trained intelligence analysts watching the blurry screens. The multi-million-dollar drones could confidently tell you that a genuinely warm biological body had quietly entered a specific mud-walled compound deep in the remote valley. However, they could absolutely not tell you who that specific body actually was, what precise equipment it was actively carrying, or whether it had any genuine, verifiable connection whatsoever to the violent local insurgency. This created a massive intelligence gap that fundamentally altered the tactical reality. The United States flew multi-million-dollar drones at 20,000 feet to find the enemy, yet an Australian sniper lying in the dirt could tell you exactly how many sugars a Taliban commander stirred into his morning tea. Lying perfectly motionless in a brilliantly concealed position exactly 1.5 kilometers away from a target compound, the elite operator peered intently through a high-powered, military-grade spotting scope, quietly gathering devastatingly precise human intelligence that billion-dollar technology completely missed. Through extreme patience, he could positively identify the specific targeted man by the unique, distinctive way he confidently walked across the open courtyard and the specific hand he naturally favored when eating. He carefully noted the exact color of his worn leather sandals and precisely identified the specific, highly modified AK rifle variant he casually carried over his shoulder. He could meticulously map the entire compound's complex, internal daily routine across a full week of continuous, unbroken observation, meticulously noting exactly when the heavily armed perimeter guards regularly changed their repetitive shifts. This intense surveillance revealed exactly when unknown visitors frequently arrived at the location, precisely which heavy wooden doors were physically reinforced against explosives, and exactly which mud walls were structurally thin enough to quietly breach. The incredibly rich, deeply granular human intelligence systematically gathered through just a single, patient Australian observation post comfortably contained significantly more immediately actionable tactical detail than an entire solid month of extremely expensive, blurry thermal drone footage continuously analyzed by dozens of exhausted intelligence officers sitting safely inside massive air-conditioned concrete bunkers. The bloated Pentagon establishment had foolishly spent a literal fortune continuously building highly sophisticated, wildly expensive electronic eyes high up in the dark Afghan sky. The pragmatic Australians had, very simply, and much more effectively, put their own highly trained human eyes directly on the unforgiving ground right next to their sleeping targets. The massive resulting difference in actual verified combat results was almost darkly comical to anyone actively cleared to view the highly classified operational statistics being quietly generated in the deeply contested southern provinces of the country. When the decisive time finally arrived to convert this incredibly precise human intelligence into kinetic action, the stark tactical contrast between the coalition partners became even more embarrassingly obvious. American high-value target operations during the mid-2000s were massive, chaotic productions genuinely worthy of a stressed Hollywood logistics coordinator. These complex missions required multiple agonizing weeks of meticulous planning and navigating through numerous overlapping approval chains stretching continuously from the frustrated field commander all the way up to senior officers, sitting in Kabul. A standard American strike package typically included multiple heavy transport helicopters, heavily armed attack helicopters, and fixed-wing close-air support aircraft perpetually orbiting at a high altitude. They also required a heavily armed quick-reaction force permanently staged at a nearby forward operating base, dedicated medical evacuation, aviation assets kept on immediate standby, and a real-time video feed piped continuously back to massive joint operation centers. There, Dozens of anxious staff officers safely watched the chaotic action slowly unfold on glowing flat screens. When a designated high-value target was located securely sitting inside a densely populated civilian area, and a direct ground assault was officially deemed far too politically risky, the standard default American solution frequently involved a heavy guided munition dropped from extreme altitude. This deeply flawed mechanical method occasionally achieved its primary tactical objective of eliminating the insurgent leader, while simultaneously destroying numerous surrounding mud structures. This devastating collateral damage consistently generated massive civilian casualties that rapidly became the Taliban's absolute most effective local recruiting tool. Fighting the Americans was conventional warfare, an impending mechanical storm you could hear coming from 20 kilometers away. Fighting the Australians was something closer to a haunting. Australian strike operations looked absolutely nothing like the massive, deafening American theatrical productions that continuously terrorized the Afghan countryside. After carefully enduring many exhausting days or freezing weeks of painstaking, uninterrupted silent surveillance, an elite SASR combat patrol would deliberately select a precise tactical window during the absolute darkest, coldest hours, well past midnight, to execute their deadly raid. They silently descended from their freezing, elevated mountain observation positions strictly on foot, rapidly covering the treacherous rocky ground in a state of near-total absolute silence. They skillfully approached their designated high-value target compounds along highly specific, thoroughly memorized hidden routes that had been meticulously mapped during their exhaustive observation phase. They expertly exploited every single piece of natural dead ground and deeply cast moonlight shadow to perfectly mask their lethal, rapid approach from the completely unsuspecting, heavily armed insurgent perimeter guards sleeping nearby. There were absolutely no loud, thumping transport helicopters hovering aggressively overhead to foolishly advertise the impending violent assault to the entire sleeping valley. There were absolutely no massive, 20-ton armored vehicles loudly grinding their heavy gears through the dusty village outskirts, crushing local crops and waking up every single stray dog. Furthermore, there were absolutely no supersonic fighter jets loudly circling at extreme altitude, their powerful, roaring jet engines distinctly audible to absolutely every single nervous insurgent possessing functionally clear, unblocked human ears. Instead, the highly trained Australians seamlessly breached the reinforced mud walls and aggressively cleared the dark internal rooms with a terrifying speed and absolutely controlled, calculated ferocity that deliberately left absolutely no margin for fatal error. The heavily armed insurgents inside were violently jolted awake by the sudden, overwhelming kinetic shock of heavily armed shadow figures already standing aggressively over their beds. The elite operators successfully secured the chaotic premises, fully neutralizing any immediate lethal threats before the confused enemy could physically grab their loaded weapons. Having successfully secured their primary objective, they rapidly extracted with their designated high-value target tightly bound, or they quietly confirmed the lethal elimination of the insurgent commander in the dark dust. They completed this incredibly dangerous kinetic operation and vanished entirely back into the harsh mountain wilderness, well before the very first pre-dawn religious call to prayer ever softly echoed across the freezing, silent valley. The incredibly brief, highly violent midnight engagement left the surviving, deeply traumatized enemy fighters completely bewildered and profoundly terrified. The insurgents were no longer afraid of superior firepower. They were terrified of ghosts who materialized inside their compounds at 2 a.m. and vanished before the call to prayer. By the exact time the wider remote village finally stirred awake to investigate the confusing midnight commotion, the heavily armed Australian patrol was already many kilometers away. They were seamlessly dissolving directly back into the rugged, freezing mountains, exactly as though the pitch-black night itself had simply opened its massive jaws and swallowed them whole. The unbelievable operational statistics that continuously accumulated over successive, highly successful SASR combat rotations actively created a massive institutional problem that senior American military commanders found increasingly difficult and deeply embarrassing to completely ignore. The remarkably small Australian contingent, constantly fluctuating between just 100 and 150 active elite operators deployed at any given operational time, was consistently generating a wildly disproportionate, truly staggering share of total high-value target elimination results across the entire, heavily contested southern Afghan military theater. In the deeply volatile Uruzgan province, their primary assigned area of strategic operations strictly centered on the dangerous regional capital of Tarin Kowt. The elite Australians systematically dismantled deep-rooted Taliban command and control networks with an absolutely ruthless, terrifyingly systematic precision. Neighboring, heavily reinforced American-led military provinces utterly failed to effectively replicate these staggering operational successes. Despite continually deploying more than 10 times the total combat personnel and violently expending exponentially greater amounts of expensive, highly advanced kinetic military resources trying to achieve similar results. This massive, undeniable cost per result, operational disparity rapidly became an incredibly sensitive, highly radioactive topic of discussion among senior officers stationed at the main ISAF headquarters in Kabul. Official military briefing slides directly comparing coalition force tactical effectiveness had the extremely unfortunate, highly embarrassing effect of actively making the absolutely wealthiest, most technologically powerful military organization in human history look exactly like it was foolishly paying outrageous luxury premium prices for remarkably poor, thoroughly ineffective, and deeply disappointing economy-class counterinsurgency combat outcomes on the ground. Meanwhile, highly terrified senior Taliban regional commanders hiding in the mountains began desperately issuing strict standing combat orders that genuinely revealed significantly more about the deadly Australian operational effectiveness than any highly classified coalition intelligence assessment ever possibly could. Hardened local insurgent fighters were strictly instructed by their panicked leadership to absolutely avoid actively engaging any small Australian combat patrols they might accidentally encounter. They were ordered to quietly hide their weapons and simply let the terrifying bearded phantoms pass through their territory completely undisturbed. The fundamental reason behind this incredibly cowardly insurgent directive had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with any perceived coalition superiority in overwhelming, deafening kinetic firepower. The small, lightly equipped Australian long-range combat patrols carried roughly the exact same standard light infantry, small arms, and limited ammunition as absolutely everyone else operating in the hostile environment. The profound, paralyzing fear genuinely stemmed from something significantly darker, deeply psychological, and fundamentally much harder for conventional military analysts to accurately quantify or effectively track on a spreadsheet. The highly unpredictable Australians continuously materialized entirely without any prior warning, violently struck their designated targets with an absolutely disorienting, terrifying physical speed, and then completely vanished back into the harsh landscape before any coherent, organized, insurgent armed response could possibly form. The devastating psychological impact of this completely silent, highly lethal methodology utterly broke the enemy's fighting spirit in the region, setting the perfect tactical stage for a massive, deeply humiliating institutional reckoning that the inflexible American military establishment could no longer avoid. The narrative now arrives at its most satisfying turn, the exact moment when institutional pride collided with harsh reality, and reality won by a devastating knockout. Those rigid American generals who had furiously filed grooming complaints began receiving operational briefings that made their earlier administrative outrage look spectacularly petty. Meanwhile, those indignant staff officers who had tried to ban the Australians from the dining hall found themselves reviewing tactical data that proved a harsh truth. The scruffy men they had insulated were actively outperforming every comparable American unit currently deployed across the entire vast military theater. The traditional conventional colonels, who had previously openly mocked the completely unarmored Australian vehicles, were quietly informed of another incredibly embarrassing operational statistic. They learned that the official SASR casualty rates from deadly improvised explosive device strikes were remarkably low across the board. This success occurred precisely because the highly unusual, lightweight vehicles they had relentlessly ridiculed were simply too fast, far too quiet, and wildly too unpredictable for the hidden insurgents to target effectively. The massive American institutional response to these undeniable tactical revelations slowly unfolded, gradually and almost sheepishly, across the higher echelons of command. The Pentagon essentially reacted exactly like a massive, struggling multinational corporation, quietly adopting a much smaller rival competitor's highly successful business strategy while desperately pretending it was their own brilliant idea all along. Suddenly, elite Green Beret teams actively operating in the deeply remote, mountainous Afghan provinces started intentionally growing massive facial hair. They suddenly sported full, entirely untrimmed, and unapologetically wild beards that absolutely would have earned them an immediate, severe formal counseling statement in any standard conventional Army infantry unit just a few short months prior to this profound, undeniable, and totally unacknowledged tactical shift. The official bureaucratic justification quickly offered by American commanders for this sudden change was basic cultural sensitivity and enhanced local engagement. This was exactly the identical, highly pragmatic justification the veteran Australians had clearly given several years earlier when they were mercilessly ridiculed by those same officers. Then, quite predictably, the heavy ceramic armor finally started coming off the American operators. Elite Special Forces personnel, embarking on extended combat patrols, actively began leaving their incredibly heavy, profoundly restrictive ballistic plates securely behind inside their dusty forward operating bases, completely abandoning the entrenched institutional obsession with maximum physical protection. They rapidly switched to utilizing significantly lighter tactical plate carriers or completely stripped-down chest rigs that willingly sacrificed absolute physical protection for desperately needed battlefield mobility. The fundamental tactical reasoning quietly adopted by the Americans was absolutely identical to the proven Australian operational logic. A physically unburdened combat soldier who can seamlessly and silently move through treacherous mountain terrain for 12 continuous hours fundamentally covers significantly more tactical ground. Consequently, they consistently generate far more actionable operational results than an exhausted soldier, fully encased in 30 kilograms of rigid protection, who sounds precisely like a walking hardware store. The numerous tactical combat vehicles aggressively utilized by American forces naturally underwent the absolute most visible, highly dramatic physical transformation during this quiet doctrinal revolution. Standard American Special Forces ground mobility vehicles systematically shed their heavy armored doors, their bulky metal roof panels, and their incredibly dense supplementary ballistic armor kits. Sturdy steel roll bars and completely open, highly exposed heavy weapon mounts suddenly appeared on these newly modified trucks. The newly altered silhouettes of these completely unarmored American vehicles, frequently photographed covered in thick Afghan dust, bore a truly uncanny, almost embarrassing visual resemblance to the Australian platforms. They looked exactly like the heavily mocked special reconnaissance vehicles that had consistently provoked such intense institutional horror and widespread administrative outrage just a few short operational rotations earlier. Highly elite Navy SEAL teams actively deployed across the rugged country rapidly adopted strikingly similar, drastically stripped-down structural configurations for their own dedicated desert mobility packages. If an observer simply placed a photograph of a standard American Special Operations vehicle from the year 2005 directly next to a newly modified one from 2009, they would naturally assume the second image depicted an entirely different military. Fundamental tactical doctrine aggressively shifted in perfect parallel with these highly visible, profound physical equipment transformations across the battle space. American Special Operations teams quietly began conducting rigorous, multi-week autonomous combat patrols deep into the hostile wilderness. They purposefully stayed out in the unforgiving field environment for heavily extended periods rather than blindly operating on the highly predictable, terribly inefficient daily commute schedule that had unfortunately defined their earlier, less successful combat rotations. They deeply integrated vital human intelligence gathering directly into their primary operational rhythm, deliberately spending countless hours respectfully sitting with powerful, highly influential local village elders. They willingly accepted countless cups of traditional local tea, meticulously mapping complex tribal social networks and successfully building the precise kind of intimate, ground-level cultural understanding that absolutely no multi-million-dollar thermal drone or highly advanced electronic signals intercept could ever possibly provide. The massive, highly ambitious American Village Stability Operations Program, which eventually became one of the genuinely more successful strategic initiatives of the entire long war, essentially followed a basic operational template that the seasoned Australian combat forces had been successfully executing since their very first quiet rotation into the dangerous southern theater of the complex conflict. Even the fundamental daily food significantly changed for the deployed American tactical operators working far outside the massive base perimeters. They drastically reduced their heavy reliance on terrible, chemically preserved MRE rations and aggressively began purchasing fresh local provisions directly from indigenous farmers. This dramatic, highly unauthorized logistical shift absolutely would have triggered a massive cascade of panicked health and safety waivers back in the conventional regular army. However, it made complete, obvious tactical sense to absolutely anyone who finally understood that long-term survival in a brutal counterinsurgency environment actively depended on completely becoming entirely indistinguishable from the environment. The massive Pentagon bureaucracy publicly acknowledged absolutely none of this profound doctrinal transformation. Of course, there were absolutely no grand, highly publicized military press conferences officially announcing that the absolute wealthiest, most technologically advanced military organization in human history had essentially been forced to diligently take tactical notes from a tiny contingent of scruffy Australians. This incredibly lethal foreign unit was genuinely small enough to comfortably fit inside a single commercial passenger aircraft. Absolutely no official American military doctrine publications ever formally credited the highly secretive Australian SASR by name for revolutionizing their fundamental approach to the entire grueling war. Furthermore, absolutely no prestigious military medals were ever officially awarded to anyone for the incredibly pragmatic, highly effective tactical innovation of simply growing a scruffy beard. However, deep inside the highly insular, strictly professional global special operations community, where genuine respect is exclusively earned through continually demonstrated, undeniable battlefield competence, the rugged Australian operational reputation rapidly reached a legendary level that genuinely bordered on pure, modern mythology. American tactical operators who had actually served directly alongside these quiet SASR teams consistently and emphatically placed them among the absolute finest, most lethal combat soldiers they had ever personally encountered anywhere. The highest praise ever awarded to the SASR wasn't a medal. It was the silent sight of the world's most powerful military, quietly discarding its own rulebook to become exactly like the men they had once laughed at. Several highly prominent United States Special Operations combat veterans have openly stated in various post-service civilian interviews that the ruthless, highly efficient Australian tactical methodology represented exactly what the entire massive global military coalition should have fully adopted. From the absolute first day, their heavy combat boots initially touched the dusty Afghan time soil. The broader historical lesson embedded in this story resonates deeply. What the Australian SASR clearly demonstrated in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan was a fundamental operational principle that absolutely every bloated, heavily bureaucratized global institution actively resists, accepting until desperate circumstances violently force the issue. A smaller, fundamentally leaner, and vastly more mentally adaptable organization will always eventually outperform a significantly larger, much heavier, and infinitely more strictly regulated entity when the surrounding operating environment becomes highly chaotic. This remains especially true when the intelligent adversary is extremely fluid, highly adaptable, and the fundamental underlying rules of the deadly strategic game continuously change entirely without any prior warning whatsoever. The massive American military had fundamentally approached the complex Afghanistan conflict exactly the way a bloated multinational corporation approaches a completely failing overseas market. They blindly threw endless money, highly advanced technology, massive personnel headcount, and suffocating administrative management layers directly at the tactical problem until the situation was essentially reclassified as someone else's responsibility. The pragmatic Australians brilliantly approached it the exact way. A tiny, desperate outfit with absolutely no margin for waste approaches a lethal survival situation. They ruthlessly cut everything unnecessary, implicitly trusted their people on the ground, and exclusively measured success by actual combat outcomes. The massive Pentagon establishment blindly spent untold trillions of dollars in Afghanistan to ultimately produce heavily fortified Burger Kings, strictly mandated reflective neon PT belts, and utterly useless administrative after-action reports, literally measured by the metric kilogram. Meanwhile, the incredibly lethal Australian SASR actively operated on a tiny budget that a standard mid-tier American defense contractor would genuinely consider a minor administrative overhead expense. That minuscule Australian budget efficiently produced massive, undeniable combat results, primarily measured by the significant, verifiable number of terrified Taliban regional commanders who suddenly stopped sleeping soundly at night inside their heavily fortified mountain compounds. There is a powerful, deeply profound final historical image that is truly worth holding on to tightly. Long after the massive coalition military forces had finally completed their highly chaotic, deeply controversial total withdrawal from the broken Afghan nation, several retired, high-ranking American military generals appeared in a fascinating series of deeply reflective media interviews. They were quietly offering heavily measured, extremely cautious public assessments regarding exactly what had gone so terribly wrong over 2 entire decades of continuous, incredibly bloody, and massively expensive warfare. Their chosen language was incredibly careful, and their ultimate institutional conclusions were heavily and predictably hedged. However, a very distinct, undeniably common tactical thread beautifully wove its way directly through their various public retrospectives, constantly surfacing again and again in only slightly different, highly sanitized phrasing. They solemnly stated that they definitely should have been much lighter. They absolutely should have been significantly faster, and they genuinely should have implicitly trusted their own brave people vastly more, while trusting their massive bureaucratic systems significantly less. Most tellingly, they solemnly admitted that they should have listened to their highly experienced coalition partners much earlier in the conflict. They never specified which exact foreign partners they meant. That glaring, highly intentional public omission essentially said absolutely everything that ever truly needed to be said about the undeniable tactical reality of the long war. Somewhere securely located in a very quiet, deeply unassuming coastal suburb of sunny Perth, residing inside a highly secretive military regiment that has absolutely never actively sought public headlines, and whose quiet members would genuinely rather chew broken glass than ever give a flashy television interview, those specific, highly sanitized words from the American generals would have ultimately earned absolutely nothing more than a very brief, entirely indifferent, and barely noticeable physical nod. Perhaps a solitary, incredibly dry local beer would be very quietly raised in the general direction of absolutely no one in particular sitting inside their private team room, because that is precisely how these elite Australian tactical operators have always carried their tremendous, undeniable battlefield victories throughout history. They carry them entirely without any public ceremony, absolutely without any loud fanfare, and with the quiet, absolute, unshakable certainty of deeply hardened, supremely competent men who already fundamentally knew the correct tactical answer long before the highly complex strategic question was ever officially asked by the massive, thoroughly confused American military.